Welcome back, artists. I'm Wyatt Paints, and today I'm painting Mr. Inevitable himself, Thanos. With all the villains I've been doing here, it was a matter of time before old Grimace Face found his way onto my painting table. Now, compared to the other busts I've done, Thanos has a much more traditional skin texture, even though it's purple. And my client is looking for a much more movie-accurate look, so I'm gonna have to lean heavily on the airbrush for this one. And while most painters would say,
oh, you could do the exact same thing with a brush,
I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I have never in my life gotten anywhere near the buttery smooth transitions with a brush that I can with an airbrush, no matter how much time I've given. That's just honesty. So when I'm tasked to produce a lifelike product, I've got to use the best tool for the job. In this case, an airbrush. And speaking about using the best tool for the job, I'm going to be breaking out a new technique that I picked up from a fellow painting YouTuber, Just Paint It. Over there they have a focus on painting lifelike sculpts and garage kits. Be sure to check him out if you're ready to pick up some high-level skills, because this guy can really sling some paint. Now, I've got a lot of work to do, so I'm going to head to my spray booth. Let's get started. I'm going to break Thanos up into 3 main stages: skin, shirt, and armor. Going inside out, I started with his skin, beginning with violet as my base. Now, with skin like this, I found one of the most powerful things I can do is not underestimate the power of the transparency of acrylic paint. After thinning down my paint, I started building up my first color over black. Since I'm going for a non-stylized look, I want the black to do the heavy lifting in the shadows. While I will come back with a bit of shade in a later step, making sure I don't overpaint here is key in creating natural shading to the face. So while this means I do get into the deep shaded areas like underneath his chin, I'm looking to more tint the darkness purple, while giving the forward and upward facing surfaces a more opaque coat to create the first step of a Zenthenial lighting scheme. After a few minutes to dry, the deepest purple was looking good. Next, Grimoire Purple, but I'm just going to call it Grimace Purple. To help ease these transitions, I'm thinning these paints in the same cup that I used in the previous color. Here, a little bit of the violet left over in the cup will lend slightly to pairing the 2 hues. But again, proper thinning is important to give me plenty of wiggle room when it comes to blending up to the next color. For this mid-tone, I began restricting my spray angle to a 40-ish degrees or higher. This continues the Zenthenial highlight scheme I started in the previous step, but it's important to not be too rigid with this or the shadows will look too sharp around his cheeks and end up giving the model a Nosferatu look. So I made sure to trace this tone down the sideburns of his jawline. Doing this actually adds the illusion of much more volume and widen his jaw, making him more imposing. If you miss this highlight here, the end result will be a more narrow and angular face. Once it was dry, the characteristics of the face were starting to show. Now to make them shine with a final highlight of Toxic Boil. Like before, I used the same cup to have a bit of the previous color to help shift this periwinkle slightly darker. Even with that touch of Grimace Purple, this is still a fairly light purple, almost a pink, so that means being extra careful not to overpaint and have Thanos looking more pink than I want him to. I was also mindful to keep my spray angle even higher than before, opting for a 70 to 80 degree angle. So as you can imagine, most of this ended up on the top of his head. Because of this, I did have to lower the spray angle slightly when going over the front of his face. But so long as I kept it as a very light touch here, I can lighten the overall face while maintaining the very dramatic shadows I made. 2 minutes in front of my fan and he was looking pretty good, but it was a bit too uniform. So I loaded up some Darucci Violet. Spraying this from below allowed me to reinforce the shadows with an extra tint of purple, but it also let me soften the edges of the shadows on his face. For my faces, I like a softer, more ambiguous shadow. I think it leads a bit more of a natural look. While I'm miniature painting for the tabletop, you tend to want to push the contrast just as far as you can possibly bear. But once you get to these scales, softer transitions tend to lead to a much more polished final look. And just to add a bit more something to the skin, adding a bit of freckling goes a long way. So with a little bit of the shade still left in my pot, I dropped down my air pressure to about 7 to 9 psi until my brush was just spitting random little dots. Now, the key with this is to not overdo it. I give an area 1, maybe 2 spritzes and then move on. I'll set it once and I'll say it again here. Less is more. If you go too hard on this, your bust will look like it has a really bad acne problem. After the speckles dried, the skin was looking great. Time to move on to the shirt. But first, I'll have to lay down a mask to protect that skin. After clear coating to save our place, I wrapped it up in a basic mask using Saran Wrap and masking tape. Be sure to use a good quality tape here. Cheap stuff won't pull any paint thanks to the clear coat, but you do risk it leaving a residue. Once I got the tape close to the edge, I switched to a liquid mask. Now, this stuff is great when you have a surface or area that you need a mask that you can't really use tape to get around on. But one word of warning, do not use any of your good brushes for this. I have never been able to get this stuff out of a brush, so I only use cheapos that I get in a pack of 50. Also, once you get this stuff out, the clock is ticking. So the best advice as I can give you, use a little bit at a time. Once you start, you just have to keep that live edge going and build on it until you've completed your mask. If you wait even a few minutes and go back and touch it, it'll start ripping it up. So if you think you need a second coat or the area is a little thin, wait until it dries and then go back to add a second coat. Also, as a final word of warning, you only want to leave this stuff on for a couple of hours. If you're in a particularly arid environment, you might have less. If you leave this stuff on too long, it'll completely dry out and bond to your model, so keep that in mind. I knew it was dry once it got darker and translucent, and I was ready for the next step, using Nightmare Black. Looking at the bust, it's sculpted so that his shirt becomes the rocks. So I'm gonna lean into that by painting them together. The idea being that his shirt will be a muted ash blue that fades into the black of the rocks. So a majority of this will be towards the top of the bust. So spraying from below will keep me from having to worry about overspray and just focus on getting the color where I need it. And with the Nightmare being so close to black, this step was finished fairly quickly. After drying, it was looking ready for the follow-up color, somber gray. Really, this is more of a blue than a gray, but paint manufacturers do love their creative copyrightable names. Whatever you want to call it, it was a perfect shade for his shirt. I tried to focus this on his upper back and chest, with a touch falling towards the bottom to highlight the umber fade to black, so a bit more discipline with the spray was needed. But just as with the skin, a few moments to dry and Thanos was looking ready for the next step. But first, a bit more masking to isolate his shoulder armor. And as you can see, the brush I was using in the first masking session has become a matted mess. Thankfully, it's still good enough for what I'll need to do, so no worries. But I was not kidding. This stuff will kill your brush. Cheapos only. Once all my liquid masking has dried, Thanos was ready for some bling, beginning with bright bronze. Now, because all of the mask, I have the advantage of not having to be too careful when spraying, but that just means I have to pay extra attention to getting even applications. And with metallics, it's even more important. Even through an airbrush, the particles in a metallic can build up fast and create a texture on the surface. And once that happens, you have very few paths to proceed. You can either try to overload it evenly all over, which in my experience never turns out how I hope they would, or strip it down and start over. So it's best for everybody to just go as slow as you please until you get a nice even coat. Once it was looking dry, it was time for a bit of shading, with light tone to add a bit of surface variation. Unlike with the previous shade, I'm using this more of an all-over, mainly to dull down the shine of the bronze. Looking at different reference photos at Thanos from Infinity War, while his armor was almost always clean, it was never really shiny. It was more of a sophisticated, subdued luster. I feel this shade gives me that subtle shift I'm looking for. Once it was dry, he was looking pretty great, but he was going to need more than just one metal tone for his armor. So that means more masking, and this time in the recesses. I didn't catch this on camera, but I can sum it up in 2 words: long and tedious. After which, I loaded up Glorious Gold as my second metal. Once again, thanks to masking, I was able to go a bit faster in this step and only really slowed down to ensure even coverage. And with such small areas to paint, I was done with this layer in about 2 minutes flat, which is kind of annoying because it took me like 30 minutes to do the mask. In short order, the gold was dry and was ready for some shading as well. Here's where an old favorite came to help out: sepia. Now, this is a much stronger shade compared to light tone, so I was prepared for the massive amount of shading that this was going to give me. I decided to use this to make some dramatic shadows near the center of his chest. This gave me a very dynamic center view line. I think of it as an imaginary line, from the base to the top of his head. For a bust like this, it's that center line that will trace the path of the viewer's initial gaze. So I want to load up that line with as much visual interest as I can. Once it was dry, it was time to unmask. And while I do that in the background, I figure this is a great time to take a moment to thank my subscribers over on Patreon. Your monthly support helps keep the lights on and me in some of the finer things in life, like these sexy nudes I got from the 99-cent store. I like them because they make me feel cheap. If you would like to join the pinnacle of the painting pantheon, you can find a link to my Patreon in the description below. You'll also find some Amazon links to some products that were used in this video. And if you use them, know that the channel earns a small commission. For now, Thanos looks like he's ready for the next step. Let's get on to it. After unmasking, I was surprised to find a few areas where my mask had failed me, but a quick spray of blue fixed things right up, and it was time to get in close for some details. And I'm going to start with the whites of the eyes, using a mix of Frostbite and Merrill White. This is a basic 50-50 mix, as I don't like using pure white on a model of this scale, and for my money, tinting the whites of eyes to a cool color gives the model a sharper stare. When putting this in, it's important to try not to paint the inside edge of the eyelid. This is a common mistake that ends up making the faces look bug-eyed. If you do overpaint here, it's a good idea to go ahead and clean this up now using the darkest color of shadow you intend to use on the face. So in this case, violet with a bit of Darucci shade mixed in. Once the base dried, red wash was dabbed in to simulate the thin strip of flesh around the ridge of the eyelid. It happened so fast that I didn't even catch it on film. Sorry, but this is how it looked after it dried. Next, I came in with a thinned down 75-25 mix of white and Frostbite to re-whiten the eye, because for the next step, I'm gonna need it as white as I can get it, while also maintaining that red tinted outline. While I gave the eyes time to dry, it was a good point to go ahead and grab Darucci and touch up and enhance all the shadows of his face. For this kind of job, I need a liner brush, and you can tell a liner brush by its narrow and long belly. This lets it settle into a groove and follow it. Using this to the full effect, I inked all of the deepest lines on his face, and once I got comfortable with how it was coming off my brush, I went in for the finer lines. In my experience, it always tends to be a good idea to do them in this order. After giving the skin a full once over, Thanos was ready to get his eyes in place. Using a nice bit of tech, these are eye decals from Evolution X Studios. I was not given these, I paid full price for them, but I got this tip from fellow painting channel Just Paint It, and they convinced me to give them a try. So I ordered the whole range of sizes, and they came in all the colors I could possibly need. Once I chose the correct size and color I wanted from my model, I cut them and trimmed off as much of the excess white as I could. Then I chopped him down in half to match his half-closed glare. And just before I applied the decals, I made sure to give each eye a couple of coats of gloss varnish. This will give the decals a super smooth surface to adhere to. Then, using brushes, I worked the decals into position. If you wet the surface with a little bit of water beforehand, it makes it a little bit easier to slide around. Once I got them into the position I liked, I let them completely dry. Then I gave them a couple coats of gloss varnish so they were nice and reflective and hide the edges of the decals. Now all that's left is to finish off the bottom of the rocks of the base. I wanted something simple that wouldn't detract from the face, so I settled on a subtle, gradual buildup of frostbite on the rocks and the plinth. Using Big Floof, this is a much lighter dry brush than I typically use, so you may notice that I had to reload my brush a lot. This is all necessary to achieve that faint application. And to be fair, you kinda dance with the devil letting paint get as dry as I am. But I got Big Floof on a set with like 15 other brushes for less than $10, so even though she has a name, Big Floof is very replaceable. If your brushes are less replaceable, or you're less than immaculate with your afterbrush care, I would warn you from brushing this dry. Once that was done, I moved my attention to the embossed icon. While I like the idea of leaving the chiseled layers with just a dry brushing, the Avengers icon could use a splash of color. I almost grabbed the classic Avengers red, but then I remembered that was only used for the Age of Ultron movie. Infinity War used gold, so glorious gold it is. Thinning this way down gave me a nice pressed gold leaf look, and once I saw it, I knew this was done. And oh boy, Thanos, you looking my dude. Is this something you'd like to give a try? If so, I'll leave a link to the free STL in the description below. And if you do, be sure to post a picture so I can check out your take on that great purple one. If you enjoyed this video, this would be a great time to like, subscribe, and leave a comment. Also, be sure to check out a fellow painting YouTuber, Sergeant Digital Design. He just got finished completing a very large Thanos statue that's worth checking out. Also, special thanks to Just Paint It for the awesome tip on the eye decals. They came out perfect. Now, I gotta get back to work, so until next time, thank you for watching, stay creative, and always enjoy the process.